Well, maybe at some time in the past you've heard the following saying: God has lots of children, but God has no grandchildren. And I believe that what we read in our reading this morning confirms this piece of wisdom handed down to us. Now we're going through the Old Testament in a bit of a series, and we want to kind of capture the larger story of the Old Testament. And so I want to just update you quickly on where we've been so that we can kind of move forward this morning in our story. Last week we looked at Moses at the burning bush, where Moses is given the call to serve God, and he also asks God, well, who is it that sends me? And God gives to Moses the great name, Yahweh sends you. And Moses goes back to the Israelite people with that name. Our reading this morning, we have telescoped now to the other end of Moses' life. So in the rearview mirror are the struggles that Moses underwent with Pharaoh in order to rescue the Hebrew people from under Pharaoh's thumb. In the rearview mirror also are the plagues visited upon Egypt. Behind the Israelites now is the daring escape from the pursuing army of Egypt as they were given a path through the Red Sea. The Israelite people have experienced the joy and freedom of liberation from slavery. They stood together trembling at the base of the mountain of God and received from his own lips the laws that were to guide them in their newly found freedom as the people of God. God guided his people as they wandered through the desert. The people were fed and watered by God's own hand because God provided them manna and quail and even water coming out of rocks. Behind them now, too, is their failure to trust God in the desert, and the result that a journey that maybe should have only taken a few days or weeks has in fact taken them 40 years. An entire generation of Israelites has perished in the wilderness just as God had decreed. The people who are listening to these words that we read this morning are standing on the cusp of the land that God has promised to his people. So behind them are the dramatic actions that God takes to rescue this people and the ways in which he shapes and forms them into the people he expects them to be. Moses himself has been warned that he too will not be able to go into the land of God's promise. He is given the grace to look on it from afar, but he is not allowed himself to enter. However, God allows Moses to address his people one last time. And the words that are written in the book of Deuteronomy are known as Moses' farewell speech to his people. In fact, that's where we get the name Deuteronomy for this book. It literally means second law. The law was told to the Israelites for the second time here in this book. This time, though, Moses is repeating the law for those who did not hear it the first time. Even though the people that are hearing this farewell speech are standing on the edge of entering the land of God's promise, each and every one of them, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, are new to this. Their parents, their ancestors, perished in the desert. And Moses, too, is not long for this world. Moses lived a very full and long life. He was used greatly of God. He'd come a very long way from the incident of the burning bush. From the time that he first asks for and then receives God's name, he has the opportunity time and time again to test this God. He's able to see throughout his life that God is faithful, but he sees that through walking the path that God has put out through him. Throughout his long life, Moses has learned who God is only by following God on the path set out for him. And thereby he learns firsthand the nature and the purpose and the truth of this God. And the thing is, it didn't start with Moses, and it doesn't even end with Moses. This was also true of Moses' ancestors. Abraham taking off for a new land in his old age, Jacob fleeing God in every which way, only to be called by God to sire a nation. And it's going to be true of his descendants as well. From the Old Testament priests and prophets to the New Testament disciples and missionaries. To know God, you have to go with God. Faith is a full contact participation sport. You can't sit back and expect to really know God. You have to get up off the couch and get into the game. You have to take a risk, to try something marvelous, to reach for something that you thought was unachievable, to step out on the winding road, the end of which you cannot see from your doorstep. So the Israelites who are being addressed in the reading this morning are about to step out in faith, to set out on the winding road, the end of which they cannot see from their vantage point. They are about to become part of the unfolding story that God is telling in this world. And so keeping that in mind, if you were to look back on our reading this morning, you'll see some very interesting language there. In Deuteronomy 5:3, which we read this morning, Moses says these words, "It was not with our ancestors that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive here today. The Lord spoke to you face to face out of the fire of the mountain." Do you notice the present tense of that language? And that is especially interesting because it literally was with the ancestors of those gathered and listening to the words spoken this day that the covenant was made. This generation that's being addressed right now, the people standing on the edge of the promised land, they were not even alive on the day that God spoke on the mountain and gave his words of command. But Moses passes these words on to those who are gathered, to those who are about to step into the promised land without him. The Israelites were going into the promised land without the leadership of Moses, but they were not going without God. God and Moses knew the challenges that the Israelites were going to face in the new land, and so at this very key time in history, God gave Moses important truths to share with the people as he hands over leadership of this people to Joshua. These people are not the ones who set out from Egypt. They had never experienced the oppression of slavery. They had not been stuck on the banks of the Red Sea with the sea roaring to their backs and the army bearing down on them from the other side when God suddenly made a way right through the sea. They were not the ones who were to gather the manna and quail for the first time. And yet, the God who provided all of these things for his people, the same God who saw the misery of his people in Egypt, the same God who heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, the one who was concerned about their suffering, the one who sent Moses to them, the one who did battle with Pharaoh, the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob, this same God is going with them when they enter into the promised land. So these people are about to step out and to write the next chapter of the story. But before they're able to even set foot in the land, they need to know where they have come from before they can know where they're going. Before they move on ahead, they have to pause and look back. Before they write their own stories, they have to remember what they have come through, what the experiences of their ancestors taught them about God himself. There is a very popular saying, you need to have roots before you can have wings. I recently read a story about a teacher who asked her class to tell her the very first memory that they have in their lives. And most of the answers were the memories you might expect children to give. Early memories of parents or siblings, maybe being in a special place like a fair or a zoo, or maybe some other memorable experience that they'd gone through. But then she came to a Jewish boy in the class and she asked him his earliest memory, and his answer surprised her. He simply said his earliest memory was Abraham. The Jewish people see themselves as being descended from Abraham. They see themselves as receiving his call to leave the land that they live in and to go to the land where God will show them. They see themselves as the ones who were oppressed under Pharaoh and rescued from slavery through the Red Sea. If you will notice, when we read the 10 Commandments given again this morning, there's an important reasoning behind why these commandments were given. The 5th commandment, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. There's a reason why the Israelites are commanded to do that. The text goes on to say, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of slavery with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Notice it does not say, remember that your people were once slaves. It is, remember that you were once slaves. The Israelite people have a very deep sense of community, of having a past. They have a bigger picture that they are looking at. They trust God who acted on their behalf in the past. Because while God has a lot of children, he doesn't have any grandchildren. So how do the Jewish people know these things? How can they claim these identities and these stories for themselves? Well, the Israelite people teach their children since they are very young. The Jewish festivals are very interesting to look at because all of them have an element of teaching the children their stories, their identities, of passing on to their children what has come before. They're a way of letting those who weren't there know who they are, but also know who God is. And so their parents and their aunts and their uncles and other adults in their lives teach them the old story. They teach them who God is. And Moses does not miss his opportunity as well to teach the Israelites who they are as they're about to go forward themselves into a new territory with all its own challenges and all its own struggles. And this farewell speech of Moses, the second telling of the law, is very important in the overall biblical story. If you're to read the New Testament and look at the number of times it quotes from the Old Testament, you'll see that the book of Deuteronomy is very heavily quoted in the New Testament. And you probably recognized when we read Deuteronomy 6:4-5 this morning, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength." When an expert in the law asked Jesus for the greatest commandment, Jesus responded with these verses, known in Judaism as the Shema. And the Shema was a Jewish creed. Scott McKnight writes, "Daily, when awaking and when retiring, the observant Jew recited aloud a creed. This creed is lifted from the Bible, from Deuteronomy 6, verses 4-9. Anyone who wants to understand what Jesus means by spiritual formation needs to meditate on the Shema of Judaism. It is the Jewish creed of spiritual formation, and Jesus liked it. Indeed, as an observant Jew himself, Jesus would have recited the creed twice daily. The Shema is the first prayer that Jewish children are taught to say, and is the quintessential expression of the most fundamental belief and commitment of Judaism. As the Israelites are about to step out on their own, led by Joshua into the land of God's promise, they need to take this with them. It is vital to them that they remember their law, that they remember where they have come from and who it is who brought them through every struggle and through every battle up until this point. It is most important for them to remember, to memorize, to recite, to instruct, and to write out the Torah. They are to take the name of God and the love of God and the instructions that God has given them with them as they write the next chapter of the story. And this is true of us too. We are poised to go out into the world as we live our lives. We also participate in the great story that God is writing in the world. Our stories are the next chapter. Our acts of faithfulness are a witness to this world. And each of us has something to add to the story. Each of us has a part in the story that is being told by God to the world. It is a story of love. It is a story of grace. It is a story of a kingdom that is so very different from the world's kingdom. This upside-down kingdom, as some have come to call it. It's a story of the ways in which the least and the little and the last and the lost and the lonely come in first place and are recipients of God's special care. It's a place where the poor in spirit and those who mourn and the meek and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness and the merciful and the pure in heart and the peacemakers and those who are persecuted for righteousness are called blessed. It's a place where we love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. It's a place where God himself joins us in our sufferings and ultimately sacrifices himself for us. And each of us has a place in this story. Each of us has something to contribute to it. The call of God is to love him with our hearts and our souls and our strength. That is, we're to love God with everything that we have within us. And even if our names happen to be lost to history, God still works through little people to accomplish his purposes here on earth. God writes his story through the lives of faithful people. But as we go out and live out our stories, we need to remember where it is that we have come from. It is imperative that we repeat our stories of faith for ourselves. We repeat our stories of faith to each other. We repeat our stories of faith for our children and for all those who will come after us. As we go out, each of us will face our own challenges. We will face our own problems. We have our own hurdles to jump through. We have our own fears that haunt us and threaten to disable us. And so we tell our stories of faith to one another. We tell the stories to encourage ourselves. And we tell our stories for those who will come after us so that they will know and they will remember. And so that we will know and we will remember. One writer reminds us that the stories that we live by, the stories that shape our lives, the stories of Scripture, tell us a story that frames our vision of the world, its creator, its origin, and its destiny. So we know the truth of this world. We know the way that it came into being. We know the way in which the world fell and which it is being redeemed. And ultimately, we know where everything is headed because we read our Bibles, because we tell each other the stories that we find there. And we teach these stories to our children and to those who will come behind us. As we live out our own stories in this world, we know that we go with a God who hears the cries of the oppressed and who acts on their behalf. God is the God who brought his people out of slavery. We know that we serve a God who loves his people so much that he wants them not to look only to their own interests, but also to those of their neighbors. For instance, if you were to really look at the 10 Commandments, they each seem to fall into the pattern of the greatest commandment that Jesus gives to his people. The first number are love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second number of commandments are about loving your neighbor as yourself. The 10 Commandments are very outward focused. They're very others focused. We serve a God who spoke through the prophets and who graciously brought his people back out of their own self-imposed exile. We serve a God who is gracious and forgiving. We serve a God who provides for his people. We serve a God who speaks to his people and goes through any lengths to be in relationship with them. We serve a God who is called the Great Physician, who heals us and who brings us through those things that simply do not heal. And most importantly, we serve a God who demonstrated his own love for us in this, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We serve a God who sent his own Son to die while we were still actively opposed to him, while we were still his enemies. We serve a God who so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And as we go out, therefore, to write our own stories, which really are God's story in this world, we cannot forget where we've come from. We cannot forget who we are, and we cannot forget who God is. Now, perhaps at this point in the message, you're sitting there thinking to yourself, my goodness, but it's Thanksgiving Sunday, and my pastor hasn't even mentioned the words giving or thanks. But on the contrary, I would argue that the act of remembering who we are and who God is the very heartbeat of thanksgiving. And I want to share with you now the words of Anne Voskamp, because she puts it better than I ever could. And her work really gets at the heart of returning thanks to God for everything. And she writes this: trust is the bridge from yesterday to tomorrow, built with planks of thanks. Remembering frames up gratitude. Gratitude lays the planks of trust. I can walk the planks from the known to the unknown and know this: he holds. I can walk unafraid. Is this why the Israelites kept recounting their past in order to trust God for their future? Remembering is an act of thanksgiving, a way of thanksgiving. This turn of the heart over time's shoulder to see all the long way his arms have carried. Gratitude is a memory of the heart, writes John Baptiste Masseau. But gratitude is not only the memories of our heart. Gratitude is the memory of God's heart, and to thank is to remember God. I have read it this morning as I prayed the Psalms. The psalmist giving thanks for the memories. Give thanks to the Lord of Lords, his faithful love endures forever. Give thanks to him who made the heavens so skillfully, because his love endures forever. Give thanks to him who placed the earth among the waters. His love endures forever. Give thanks to him who made the heavenly lights. His faithful love endures forever. In memory, the shape of God's yesterday heart emerges and assures of God's now heart and reassures of his sure beat for tomorrow. It is thanksgiving that shapes a theology of trust, and the Israelites bear witness, and I see. Isn't this ultimately what Christ asks of us in the Lord's Supper? One of the very last directives that Christ offers to his disciples, the one of supreme import, but I too often neglect, to remember. Do this in remembrance of me. Remember and give thanks. This is the crux of Christianity, to remember and to give thanks. Eucharisteo. Why? Why is remembering and giving thanks the core of Christ's faith? Because remembering with thanks is what causes us to trust and to really believe. I once read the words, the foremost quality of trusting a disciple is gratefulness. It is safe to trust God. When we remember who God is, when we remember how he has been at work in the past, we can know that it is safe to trust God for our future. Whatever we may encounter in this life, we can encounter it because we know that the God who cares for us goes on with us, that he has forever earned our trust in going to the cross and in dying for us and with us and instead of us, and in rising to life again. And so as we stand here today, poised to go once again into the world, poised once again to live our lives which tell the story of God in the world, about to write the next chapter in the story of God in our lives, we too stand with the Israelites as they stand, toes touching the sand of the land of God's promise. We and they go looking ahead of them, of course, whether that's with excitement about the joys that lie ahead or trepidation for what will come next, knowing that there may be many obstacles before them. But before they can go on, they pause and they look back and they remember the words of God. Moses repeats for them the law. They are reminded of who they are and where they've been. They look back to see how very far the arms of God have carried them. And so they know that the same God that has carried them in the past will not fail to carry them in the future. And so it is with us. We go out into the world, and we may be excited for the week that's ahead and all that will hold, or perhaps our lives have some worry or anxiety, not knowing how we're going to face those things that the world is going to throw at us. But as we celebrate this Thanksgiving, as we pause and give thanks for the many blessings we have received, we know that trust is the bridge from yesterday till tomorrow, built with planks of thanks. We also look behind us and can see the very long way that the arms of God have carried us. And we can step confidently and thankfully into tomorrow. We know that whatever our future may hold, it is safe to trust God. And so we pause for a moment and say thank you. We remember what God has done, and we are thankful. Would you pray with me as we close our service this morning? All-powerful God, you created all things, the vast reaches of space, and the intricacies of the life that we live are all the work of your hands, and for these many things we give you praise. Loving God, you have redeemed us. In Jesus Christ, you have shared our humanity and given us hope. In his befriending, his teaching, and his healing, you have come close to those in need. In his death on the cross, you have dealt with our sin, and you have shown us that nothing can separate us from your love. In Christ's resurrection, you have demonstrated that death cannot have the last word, and you have shown us the hope of glory. And so as we look ahead until tomorrow, we pause for a moment to look backward at all that you have done for us and to give you thanks. Amen.